In 1534, the Spanish Empire, the most fearsome, heavily armed, and wealthiest global superpower on Earth, at the time they were forced to sit down and sign a humiliating peace treaty.
Yeah, and they didn't surrender to another European king or, concede to a rival imperial navy.
Right, no, they surrendered to a man living in a Caribbean cave.
Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we have a very specific mission. We are taking you back to the year 1502 to an island the indigenous Taíno people called Quisqueya.
Which, by the way, beautifully translates to the great and elevated land.
It's a gorgeous name. And our focus for you today is the founding of the very first European city in the Americas, which is Santo Domingo, in what is now the Dominican Republic.
Right, and if you read like a standard tourist brochure today, you'll get this neatly packaged list of firsts. The first paved street, the first cathedral, the first colonial hospital.
It presents this very clean, unbroken march of European progress.
Exactly. It feels very sanitized. But when you look at the actual history, the raw source material, the colonial diaries, the archaeological records, that pristine narrative completely falls apart.
It really does. It shatters.
So in this deep dive, we are extracting the story of what happened underneath those cobblestones. We're unpacking an incredibly complex tale of extreme opulence, forced labor, and this massive forgotten war of resistance.
And just to jump in here, we want to be crystal clear with you listening. Our goal isn't to take any modern political sides on this history.
Oh, absolutely not. We are simply following the historical record and the physical evidence exactly where it leads us. We're exploring the raw mechanics of how empires operate and how they are resisted.
It is a really profound look at the friction between, imperial ambition and human endurance.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we have to start with the sheer architectural audacity of it all. It is 1502, and a Spanish governor named Nicolás de Ovando arrives on the island.
And he doesn't just want to build a functional settlement. He intends to build a permanent psychological statement.
Right. He designs the city using this highly rigid grid system with perfectly perpendicular streets. Just palaces made of stone, blindingly white under the Caribbean sun.
The famous Damaro or checkerboard layout.
Mm-hmm.
And we really have to understand the mechanics of why he chose that specific design.
Because we look at a grid today and just think, oh, efficient urban planning.
Right. But in 1502, a grid layout is literally a piece of military technology.
Wow, really?
Yeah. Indigenous settlements in the Caribbean were often organic and circular. They were designed to work seamlessly with the natural topography, to foster communal living.
Right, they flowed with the land.
Exactly. A grid is the exact opposite. Perfectly straight, perpendicular streets create uninhibited lines of sight for cannons.
Oh, wow.
And they allow heavily armed cavalry to deploy instantly in a straight line from the center plaza straight to the perimeter.
That is wild. It's less like building a new neighborhood and more like slamming a giant architectural boot onto the island's throat.
That's a perfect way to put it.
It's like a modern corporation dropping a massive, sleek headquarters right on top of a historic neighborhood. It's a physical flex.
Absolutely. They are constructing these massive stone edifices because the architecture itself is psychological warfare.
They want the indigenous population to look at the horizon and realize their old world is permanently gone.
Overwritten by this rigid, inescapable geometry. And it was a blueprint of subjugation that the Spanish would replicate everywhere.
Right. They didn't just stop there.
No, we see the exact same architectural weaponization later in Lima, Peru, where they built European structures directly over the Sacred Concha temple.
Or in Mexico, constructing cathedrals quite literally on top of indigenous pyramids.
Exactly. The city itself is the primary weapon of conquest.
And nowhere in Santo Domingo is that weapon more aggressively opulent than the Alcázar de Colón. This place was the Caribbean version of the Madrid Royal Court.
Oh, the scale of it is just staggering.
No, we are talking about a palace with 55 rooms. It was inhabited by Diego Columbus, who was the son of the famous navigator, and his wife, who was the niece of the Spanish king.
And they had imported Flemish tapestries hanging on the walls.
Right. They hosted these elite, aristocratic colonial balls, and the building itself was constructed entirely out of solid coral stone.
Which is just, think about the sheer physics of the labor required for that.
Exactly. Builders had to literally pry porous, heavy white coral rock off the seabed, drag it onto land, and shape it by hand to build a 55-room mega mansion.
It's unbelievable. And right down the street was the Casa del Cordon, which our sources note was the first two-story stone house in the Americas.
And it gets its name from a massive Franciscan cord carved directly into the stone facade, right?
Yes, and what's fascinating here is the deep, almost blinding irony embedded in that specific architecture.
How so?
Well, let's look at the Alcazar first. Despite all the Flemish tapestries, the silk clothing, and the royal balls, the historical record points out that it was actually built as a fortified palace.
Wait, really? A fortress?
Yes, it had thick defensive walls and strategic vantage points. It is the only European palace of its kind in the Americas.
So, on one hand, they are projecting absolute divine authority over the island, but structurally, they are admitting they are terrified.
Excellent. They have to sleep inside a fortress. And then you look at the Casa del Cordon.
Right, with the Franciscan cord.
The Franciscan cord is the ultimate religious symbol of a sacred vow of poverty.
Oh, the irony is thick.
Right. Yeah, here it is, deeply carved into the very first two-story luxury stone mansion in the New World. It's actively being used to legitimize a violent conquest that was entirely rooted in extreme wealth.
It is a massive contradiction carved right into the rock. You have a fortress pretending to be a party venue and a symbol of poverty slapped onto the house of a billionaire.
It really is.
But that leads us to the fundamental reality of this opulence, because you can't just drag the ocean floor onto the land, build 55-room coral palaces, and maintain a royal court without an enormous workforce.
Which raises a very important question.
Right. If the Spanish crown officially outlawed the enslavement of the indigenous population for, political and religious reasons, what exactly were these workers?
Because they certainly weren't volunteers. The Spanish bureaucracy invented a devastating legal loophole to solve this problem.
The encomienda system.
Exactly, the encomienda. And we see this exact same system documented later in sources covering Peru, Bolivia, and Mexico.
I want to dig into the actual mechanics of how this loophole worked, because they went through a lot of trouble to avoid using the word slave.
They really did, and it all comes down to legal and religious semantics. The Spanish crown's justification for being in the Americas, which was granted by papal decrees, was to spread the Catholic faith.
Right, so if you classify the Taíno people as outright chattel slaves, you run afoul of the church.
And you also change how the crown can legally tax the colonial output. So the bureaucracy created a fiction.
A very dark fiction.
Under the encomienda system, the Taínos were not owned. They were, quote, entrusted as free vassals to a Spanish colonist.
Entrusted. Wow.
Yeah. The colonists' legal obligation was supposedly to protect them, teach them Spanish, and evangelize them into the Christian faith.
And in return for this generous gift of salvation, the Taínos merely owed the colonists their labor. That is just a staggering manipulation of the law.
It truly is.
They essentially engineered a system where they could work hundreds of thousands of people to death without carrying the legal or moral baggage of the word slavery.
Because the reality on the ground had absolutely nothing to do with protection or evangelization.
Nothing at all. I mean, the archival sources are completely unambiguous about this. The Taínos were forced into unimaginably brutal conditions.
They were sent deep into the gold mines, forced to perform back-breaking agricultural labor.
And used as literal human pack animals to construct those grand stone palaces in the grid city.
Right. And the human cost of this legal fiction is one of the darkest chapters in the source material.
We are looking at one of the fastest and most devastating demographic collapses in human history.
Because the Taíno people weren't just worked to the point of severe malnutrition and physical exhaustion.
No, they were entirely defenseless against the biological realities of the invasion.
Exactly. The colonists brought European diseases, specifically smallpox, for which the isolated island population had zero immunological defense.
The combination of forced labor, starvation, and smallpox created an apocalyptic scenario for the Taíno.
Within just a few decades, an indigenous population that numbered in the hundreds of thousands was decimated.
Pushed to the absolute brink of extinction. But wait, I have to pause here.
Sure, what's up?
Because I'm looking at this Montesino story from our sources, and I have to be highly skeptical.
Oh, I know exactly what you're going to say.
Right, like we're talking about a colonial machine generating unfathomable wealth for the Spanish crown. And the narrative is that in December of 1511, a Dominican friar named Antonio de Montesinos walks up to the pulpit in Santo Domingo.
Looks directly at the wealthiest, most powerful encomenderos sitting in the pews.
And yells, "By what right do you do this? You are in mortal sin."
It's a dramatic scene.
It is. But supposedly, This one rogue friar yelling at the local billionaires on a Sunday morning actually forced the empire to draft the laws of Burgos in 1512, the first colonial labor code.
Which sounds a little too neat.
Exactly. Are we really supposed to believe that? Or is this just the Spanish Empire writing incredibly good PR for itself after the fact to look benevolent?
Your skepticism is entirely justified. And looking closely at the mechanics of those laws actually proves your point.
So it was just PR.
Well, the laws of Burgos were, in many ways, bureaucratic theater. You are right that Montesinos did preach that sermon.
Okay.
And he did refuse to retract it the following week. It caused a massive political scandal that reached the king.
So the crown had to do something.
Right. The crown realized they had a public relations nightmare with the church hierarchy back in Europe.
Yeah.
To maintain their moral authority, which was the entire legal basis for their empire, they drafted the laws of Burgos.
And the text explicitly outlined protections for indigenous women, children, and mandated fair treatment for workers.
On paper, yes.
But drafting a law in a palace in Spain and actually enforcing it in a gold mine in the Caribbean are two entirely different things.
Precisely. The oceans was the ultimate buffer. It took months for ships to cross the Atlantic.
So the local governors could just do whatever they wanted.
The geographic reality meant the colonial elites in Santo Domingo could simply ignore inconvenient legislation. The local governors were getting rich, the colonists were getting rich, and the crown's treasury was overflowing.
So despite the moral grandstanding on paper, the encomienda system just kept grinding the Taíno people into dust.
Exactly.
But that geographic failure creates a massive, purely mathematical problem for the colonizers.
How so?
Well, if you ignore the labor laws and you work your indigenous workforce to death, your economic machine suddenly runs out of fuel.
Ah, right.
The grand palaces and the gold mines require a constant supply of human labor. With the Taíno population collapsing, the Spanish are forced to look across the Atlantic to feed the machine.
And this transition fundamentally alters the entire trajectory of the Americas. To sustain the opulence of Santo Domingo, the Spanish begin importing enslaved people directly from Africa.
But in doing so, they inadvertently introduce a dynamic that absolutely terrifies them.
Yes. Our archival documents show exactly how paranoid the colonists became.
The Spanish administration explicitly categorized these enslaved Africans into two distinct groups to try and manage the risk, right?
That's right. They classified people brought directly from the African continent as bozales.
But then they had a second classification, the Ladinos.
And the Ladinos were enslaved Africans who had already lived in Spain or other European territories.
So they spoke fluent Spanish, they understood European legal customs, religious practices, social hierarchies.
And the powerful, heavily armed Spanish colonists were absolutely terrified of the Ladinos.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really exposes the great paradox of empire. Why were they so deeply afraid of the Ladinos?
Well, in 1545, Prince Philip actually wrote a formal letter warning the colonies about this.
What did he say?
He claimed that these acculturated Africans had, quote, bad inclinations and were prone to rebellion.
Bad inclinations is quite the euphemism.
It's pure projection. What Prince Philip really meant was that the Ladinos possessed a working intelligence of the colonial system.
I see.
This is the paradox. To build an economic machine of that scale, you have to train the people you are oppressing how to operate it. You have to teach them your language, your tools, your supply routes.
And the moment they know how to operate the machine, they know exactly where to throw the wrench.
Precisely. A workforce that understands the gears of your society is a workforce equipped to dismantle it.
And that paranoia wasn't just some abstract theory keeping the governor awake at night. It was an incredibly accurate prediction of their own downfall.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the system was about to be broken wide open, and the spark wasn't going to come from an outside army. It was going to come from a man who knew Spanish law better than most of the colonists did.
We are talking about Enriquillo.
Or Enrique, as the colonial texts often refer to him. And today he is celebrated as a monumental national hero in the Dominican Republic.
As he should be.
Enrique was a Taíno cacique, a leader, but he had been deeply integrated into the colonial system. He was raised and educated by Franciscan friars in a monastery.
He spoke perfectly fluent Spanish. He could read and write.
Right. He understood the intricacies of the colonial legal system and European diplomacy.
He was the absolute embodiment of what Prince Philip and the colonizers feared, an oppressed individual who had mastered the rules of their own game.
So here's what happens. A powerful Spanish colonist, a man who actually oversaw Enrique's encomienda, steals Enrique's prized horse and horribly abuses Enrique's wife.
A blatant, horrific injustice.
Now, Enrique does exactly what the civilized European legal system tells you to do. He uses his education, he travels to the colonial courts in Santo Domingo, and he files a formal legal grievance.
He points to the laws of the Spanish crown and demands justice.
And what do the colonial courts do?
They look right past him. They brush him aside, completely ignoring his meticulously filed grievance.
Because the laws on paper meant absolutely nothing in practice.
Nothing.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Enrique experiences this massive paradigm-shifting realization.
He sees with absolute clarity that the entire game is rigged.
Exactly. The European laws only exist to protect European wealth. The courts will never dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. So, if the legal system is a dead end, what is the alternative?
The alternative is the mountains.
Enrique decides he is done playing by their rules.
He gathers his people, and they abandon the rigid, grid-planned streets of the colonial settlements. They head south, deep into the Sierra del Bahoruco.
Which is this massive, incredibly rugged, densely forested mountain range.
And they initiate a war.
A war that lasts for 14 grueling years. For over a decade, the full military might of the Spanish Empire, the same empire that was currently conquering vast continents, could not capture this one man and his followers.
Because Enrique turned the conflict into a masterclass in asymmetrical warfare.
Right. I mean, think about the logistics of the Spanish military at this time.
They are an army designed to fight on flat European battlefields. They are marching in tight, rigid formations. They are lugging immensely heavy steel breastplates, iron helmets, halberds, and dragging massive cannons.
In the middle of the Caribbean jungle, where the heat and humidity are absolutely suffocating.
Exactly. The Spanish soldiers are dying of heat stroke before they even see a battle. They are exhausted, their supply lines are stretched thin, and they are entirely out of their element.
Meanwhile, Enrique and the Taíno rebels have weaponized the geography.
They know every single inch of the Bahoruco Mountains. They know the hidden limestone caves for shelter.
They know the narrow ravines for ambushes. They know exactly which local wild plants to eat and where the hidden freshwater springs are.
They move incredibly light and incredibly fast. The treacherous terrain completely neutralized the advanced European military technology.
Because a state-of-the-art cannon is utterly useless if it's stuck in 3 feet of mud at the bottom of a cliff.
And a steel breastplate is just a wearable oven in the tropical sun.
But Enrique wasn't just fighting a defensive war of survival, and more importantly, he wasn't fighting it alone. Because something totally unprecedented in the history of the Americas was happening up in those limestone caves.
The Bahoruco Mountains were becoming a magnet.
A sanctuary for the Cimarrones, the Maroons, which was the colonial term for anyone who escaped slavery and fled beyond the reach of the empire.
Yes.
Our sources point to a massively significant event in 1521 known as the Christmas Rebellion.
This is a crucial turning point.
A group of enslaved Wolof people who had been abducted from West Africa and brought to the island executed a coordinated escape from the colonial plantations.
And they made their way deep into the Bahoruco Mountains,
where they met and joined forces with Enrique's surviving Taínos. This detail is just incredible to me. You have 2 entirely distinct cultures, from completely different sides of the planet speaking different languages, thrust into this nightmare scenario.
And instead of fracturing, they forge a single, unified military and cultural alliance driven by their shared hatred of the Spanish oppression.
And this isn't just romantic folklore. Our sources detail how modern archaeologists have literally gone into the deep caves of the Bahoruco Mountains and found the physical proof of this alliance.
It's amazing. They've excavated sites where traditional Taíno ceramics and tools are sitting right next to African remains and artifacts.
Perfectly preserved in the exact same layers of sediment.
They were living together, sharing survival techniques, strategizing together. They created the very first shared, multicultural society of resistance in the Americas.
It completely dismantles the neat, tidy narrative of European conquest that the monuments in Santo Domingo try to project.
The conquest wasn't an unbroken march of victory. It was met with fierce, highly organized, multicultural resistance.
And this resistance in the mountains wasn't content to just hide in the shadows, right? They actively went on the offensive.
Which brings us to another incredible Maroon leader documented in our sources, Sebastian Lemba.
Tell us about Lemba.
Lemba's story is the perfect realization of Prince Philip's paranoia. He is a textbook example of the colonial system manufacturing the exact tools of its own destruction.
Wow.
Lemba had been captured in the Congo, survived the horrific Middle Passage, and was forced to work on the vast colonial cattle ranches on the island.
Which, ironically, provides him with the perfect military training ground. Working the ranches, he learns how to ride and command horses, and he memorizes the complex geography of the island's interior.
And when he inevitably escapes, Lemba doesn't just want to hide in a
He
cave.
wants to dismantle the oppressor's economy.
He becomes a brilliant master of economic sabotage.
Yeah.
Lemba and his highly mobile cavalry forces systematically began targeting the colonial sugar mills.
Now, we tend to think of sugar production at this time as just basic agriculture, planting and cutting cane.
But a 16th century sugar mill, an ingenio, was a massive, highly complex industrial facility. You have to crush the cane using giant water-powered or animal-powered rollers.
You have to boil the juice in a very specific sequence using imported, incredibly expensive copper fats.
It required specialized engineers, massive capital investment from European banks, and constant grueling labor.
So it's not just a farm, it's the beating heart of the colony's financial portfolio.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Lemba understood the mechanics of this wealth. He wasn't conducting random, chaotic raids. He was methodical.
He knew exactly where to hit them.
He would attack a mill and shatter the water wheels. He would destroy the imported copper vats, instantly wiping out years of European capital investment.
He would steal the cattle to starve the city's supply lines.
Most importantly, he would free the enslaved workers who knew how to run the machinery and recruit them into his Maroon army. He wasn't just stealing their sugar, he was permanently burning down the bank.
He was intentionally and systematically bankrupting the Spanish elite. And this entirely flips the perspective of what the city of Santo Domingo actually was during this period.
Completely.
Remember that 55-room coral stone palace? The thick, fortified walls. When you read the raw historical records and the panicked letters sent back to Spain during this time, you realize Santo Domingo wasn't an invincible, gleaming fortress confidently projecting power across the Caribbean.
Not at all. It was a city living in absolute paralyzing terror.
They were effectively a besieged population trapped inside their own architectural flex.
They were surrounded and slowly being bled dry by the very workforce they thought they had neatly categorized and controlled.
They built a fortress because they knew, deep down, they were entirely surrounded by the consequences of their own brutality.
And eventually, the financial and psychological pressure became too much to bear. The Spanish crown realized they were bleeding money and men.
And they could not win this asymmetrical war in the mountains.
So they do the unthinkable. In 1534, the Spanish crown, the global superpower that was in the process of conquering the Aztec and Inca empires, is forced to send a diplomat to sit down and sign a formal peace treaty with Enrique.
And we really must view that treaty for what it truly was, based on the reality of the sources. The history books might try to frame it as, like, a magnanimous diplomatic resolution orchestrated by a benevolent Spain.
But it wasn't a Spanish victory.
It was a humiliating, unavoidable confession of defeat. An empire that appeared invincible on paper had to concede its authority to a Taíno leader operating out of a limestone cave.
It's an incredible conclusion.
So what does this all mean? For you, listening right now, the next time you visit a historic city or you see a pristine, bronze-plaqued monument celebrating the grand march of civilization, remember Santo Domingo. Remember 1502.
The true history of a place isn't just found in the names of the governors and kings who ordered the stones to be laid.
The real story, the deeper, much more powerful story, belongs to the people who were forced to carry those heavy coral stones out of the sea. It belongs to the people who realized the colonial courts were permanently rigged, who broke their own chains, and who proved that rugged mountains, hidden caves, and unbreakable human alliances can actually be stronger than empire and cannons.
And if you go to Santo Domingo today, you don't just have to look at the palaces of the conquerors. You can walk into a public square and see a towering statue of Sebastian Lemba, standing tall, with his chains physically broken.
It is a modern testament to a city that is finally uncovering its foundations and honoring the people who resisted.
I think that leaves us with a critical lens for the future.
How so?
Well, the next time you walk down a cobblestone street or look up at a monument to progress, ask yourself, what invisible alliances of resistance were forged in the shadows of those buildings, and whose brilliant stories of rebellion are still waiting to be uncovered in the foundations?
A perfect question to leave things on. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.